And they had been living at the site for at least 4 years. And they had made this ridge their home. It was a place away from the government. They were a little bit nervous to see the Peruvian military there. They were afraid that Torvis was going to be conscripted into the army.
They lied to us. For decades, they said Machu Picchu was just an ancient palace. But when scientists finally scanned what's hidden underneath, they found something that makes zero sense. 60% buried. Technology that shouldn't exist. And the second these findings went public, Peru did something shocking. They fast-tracked an airport that was dead for 15 years. Why? Why flood the site with millions of tourists right after discovering what's really down there? The timing is too perfect. Someone doesn't want to study.
Pseudoscience. However, there is new evidence that the history of Machu Picchu may be much, much older than anyone has anticipated.
What scientists found beneath Machu Picchu will make your jaw drop, and what's happening right now might bury the truth forever. February 10th, 2026. While you're watching this, something unusual is happening in Peru, and it's not getting the attention it probably deserves. There's an airport project near Machu Picchu that's been sitting incomplete for 15 years. 15 years of delays, corruption investigations, cancelled contracts, and what seemed like endless political gridlock. The whole thing appeared dead in the water. But something changed recently, and it changed fast. Scientists have been conducting research around Machu Picchu for the past 5 years, using technologies that weren't available before. DNA analysis, laser scanning systems, satellite imaging. Each new study revealed something unexpected about the site. And here's the odd part. Right as these discoveries started piling up, discoveries that suggested Machu Picchu is significantly more complex than anyone realized, the Peruvian government suddenly decided that the half-built airport needed to be finished immediately. Not just finished, but fast-tracked on an aggressive timeline that has researchers genuinely concerned. The timing feels strange. For more than a decade, nothing happened with this airport. Political scandals, financial problems, bureaucratic nightmares. It was the kind of project that gets quietly forgotten. Then within months of major archaeological consultant findings being published, the government announces they're pushing ahead at full speed. They want it operational by late 2027. That's roughly 18 months from approval to actual planes landing. For context, major airport projects typically take years, sometimes a decade or more from approval to operation. This isn't just about building another airport. The plan calls for bringing in 8 million tourists per year once it's fully operational. That's double the current visitor numbers to Machu Picchu, maybe more than double depending on which estimates you use. 8 million people flowing through a valley that already struggles with its existing infrastructure. And the runway itself is being constructed on top of 600-year-old Inca agricultural terraces that, remarkably, still function today. These aren't abandoned ruins. The irrigation systems work. The drainage performs exactly as it was designed to. It's the same engineering tradition that built Machu Picchu itself. So, you have to ask the obvious question. Why now? Why, after 15 years of absolutely nothing happening, does this airport suddenly become an urgent priority right when scientists are publishing findings that suggest we've fundamentally misunderstood what Machu Picchu actually was? Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. Machu Picchu has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1983. It's widely considered one of the most important archaeological locations in the world. Researchers from Yale, Cambridge, Japanese institutions, and universities across South America have studied it for decades. But the research conducted between 2023 and 2025 revealed things that don't fit the standard narrative. Things that make you reconsider everything we thought we knew about Inca engineering, astronomy, and city planning. The conventional story, the one you'll find in most textbooks and tourist guides, describes Machu Picchu as a royal estate built by the Inca Emperor Pachacuti around 1450, a vacation retreat in the mountains, a palace complex where the emperor could escape the pressures of running an empire. It's a nice story, and for a long time it seemed to fit the evidence. But that interpretation is based largely on research from the early to mid-20th century, before modern analytical techniques existed. What the recent studies show is considerably different. According to research published by Yale University in 2023, the DNA evidence from human remains at the site indicates something far more complex than a royal retreat. The The genetic profiles suggest people from completely different regions of the Inca Empire, different ethnic backgrounds, different cultures, all buried in one location. That's not what you'd expect to find at a private estate for an emperor and his immediate circle. Then in 2024, teams using LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging, basically laser scanning from drones, discovered 12 previously unknown structures hidden beneath jungle, vegetation in areas surrounding the main complex. These weren't small buildings. These were significant architectural features that had been invisible for 5 centuries, and they were found in restricted zones, areas where tourists don't go, where most researchers haven't been allowed to work. 12 buildings that nobody knew existed, found in a matter of weeks, once someone was actually permitted to scan those areas. In 2025, geologists analyzing satellite data noticed something remarkable about the ground beneath Machu Picchu. 2 major fault lines, each stretching approximately 175 kilometers, cross directly under the site, forming an X pattern. Fault lines usually mean instability and earthquake danger. But when researchers ran computer simulations over 1,000 different earthquake scenarios, the results showed something unexpected. The intersection point of those fault lines is extraordinarily stable. The opposing tectonic forces essentially cancel each other out. It's a geological sweet spot where the ground barely moves even during significant seismic events. Peru experiences major earthquakes regularly. The region around Cusco has been hit hard multiple times throughout recorded history. But Machu Picchu, sitting right on top of this geological X formation, has stood for 500 years with minimal earthquake damage. Either the Inca got incredibly lucky picking this one spot out of thousands of possible mountain locations, or they understood something about the geology that shouldn't have been possible to know in the 15th century. And that's just the geology. Modern engineers who studied the construction in detail discovered that roughly 60% of Machu Picchu exists underground. What tourists see and photograph, the terraces, the temples, the iconic views, that represents maybe 40% of the actual engineering work. The majority of the site is below ground. Drainage systems, foundation networks, water, channels, retaining walls. An entire hidden infrastructure that manages water flow, prevents erosion, and stabilizes the mountain itself. These aren't crude systems either. According to civil engineers who've examined the site, the drainage network would be impressive by modern standards. Water flows through stone-lined channels, gets redistributed across terraces, filtered through gravel layers, and expelled at the base of the mountain with zero pooling and zero erosion after 5 centuries. This was built without iron tools, without mortar between the stones, without anything we'd recognize as modern construction equipment. And it still works today. There's also a carved stone at the highest point of Machu Picchu called the Intihuatana. The name translates roughly to the place where the sun is tied. For decades, it was assumed to be ceremonial, possibly decorative. Then someone measured it with GPS satellites. The stone is aligned within 3 degrees of true north, not magnetic north, which shifts over time, but true geographic north. It functions as a solar calendar, accurately marking solstices and equinoxes to within about 15 minutes. Year after year, century after century. 3 degrees of accuracy. That's what the Inca achieved with carved granite 500 years ago. So here's where we are. 5 years of discoveries, each one revealing that Machu Picchu is more sophisticated, more precisely engineered, and more deliberately placed than previous research suggested. DNA showing intentional assembly of diverse populations. LiDAR reveals hidden structures in restricted zones. Geological scans confirming placement on a seismically stable point that requires satellite technology to identify. Engineering analysis showing that most of the site is invisible underground. Astronomical precision that matches modern GPS calibration standards. And the Peruvian government's response to all of this new information is to approve an airport project that will more than double tourist traffic to the area. An airport that's been stuck in bureaucratic limbo for 15 years suddenly needs to be operational in 18 months. An airport that requires destroying 600-year-old functioning Inca terraces to build the runway. An airport approved before the capacity study determining whether the region can even handle that many visitors has been completed. That capacity study, the official environmental and infrastructure assessment, isn't due until September 2026. The airport was approved in February 2026. They greenlit the project 7 months before the report that's supposed to determine whether the project makes sense will even exist. Something about this timeline doesn't add up, and the more you look at when things happened and in what order, the stranger it gets. That's what we're going to examine here, because the story of what's happening at Machu Picchu right now connects scientific discovery, political decision-making, economic pressure, and some genuinely uncomfortable questions about what gets preserved and what gets paved over in the name of progress. To understand why the current situation feels so unusual, we need to look at what scientists actually found over the past 5 years. These weren't minor discoveries or incremental additions to existing knowledge. Each finding fundamentally challenged the accepted understanding of what Machu Picchu was and how it was built. Let's start in 2023. That year, researchers from Yale University did something that hadn't been done before at Machu Picchu. They extracted and sequenced DNA from 34 individuals whose remains were found buried within the citadel walls. This wasn't a casual excavation. These were carefully preserved remains that had been intentionally placed in specific locations throughout the site over what appears to be several centuries. The researchers expected to find genetic profiles consistent with highland Inca populations. That's what the historical record suggested. Machu Picchu was supposedly built as an estate for Emperor Pachacuti and his court, so the buried individuals should have been primarily ethnic Inca from the Cusco region. The DNA results told a completely different story. The genetic diversity was far beyond anything the researchers anticipated. These 34 people came from different ethnic backgrounds, different regions of the empire, different linguistic groups. They weren't all highland Inca, not even close. This suggested that Machu Picchu functioned as something other than a private royal retreat. The genetic evidence pointed to a deliberately diverse population, people brought together from across the Inca Empire for reasons that aren't immediately obvious from the historical sources. But the most striking finding involved 6 female remains. The DNA from these 6 women traced back to the Amazon rainforest, not the Andean highlands. These were lowland jungle people found at an altitude of 24 bastet, 100 meters high in the clouds, at a site supposedly reserved for Inca royalty and their immediate servants. The Amazon basin and the high Andes are completely different environments, separated by some of the most difficult terrain on the planet. You don't accidentally end up at Machu Picchu from the Amazon. Someone would have to deliberately travel hundreds of miles, climbing from sea level to 8,000 feet, crossing rivers, navigating mountain passes, enduring dramatic climate changes. Among these 6 Amazonian women, one pair stood out to the researchers, a mother and daughter, buried relatively close to each other. When the scientists analyzed the isotopes locked in their bones, the chemical signatures told 2 distinct stories. Isotope analysis can reveal what someone ate and where they lived based on the minerals that get incorporated into bone tissue over time. The mother's bones showed one dietary and geographic signature. The daughter's bones showed a different pattern. They had lived in different places at different stages of their lives, consuming different foods, drinking water from different sources. Yet both ended up at Machu Picchu. Both were buried there with apparent care and deliberation. This wasn't a random migration. This wasn't people wandering in from various parts of the empire over generations. The evidence suggests intentional movement of specific individuals to this specific location. The Yale researchers published their findings in peer-reviewed journals, and the implications were clear. Machu Picchu served a function that required bringing people from diverse ethnic and geographic backgrounds together in one place. What that function was remains unclear, but it wasn't simply a vacation home for an emperor. The natural question becomes, why bring Amazonian women to a mountain fortress? What role did they play in whatever was actually happening at Machu Picchu? The DNA evidence raises these questions but doesn't answer them definitively. What it does establish is that our previous understanding of the site was incomplete at best, possibly fundamentally wrong. While Yale was analyzing bones, other researchers were scanning from above. In 2024, a team equipped with LiDAR drones flew over sections of Machu Picchu that tourists never visit. LiDAR technology fires millions of laser pulses at the ground and measures how long they take to bounce back. This creates 3-dimensional maps of what exists underneath vegetation, soil, even shallow rock layers. It essentially allows you to see through jungle canopy and ground cover to reveal structures that would otherwise remain invisible. The drones surveyed the forested slopes surrounding the famous terraces and temples. These areas had been classified for decades as natural jungle, untouched wilderness around a known archaeological site. Nobody expected to find much there. The scans revealed 12 structures, 12 previously unknown buildings and platforms, hidden beneath centuries of vegetation growth. These weren't tiny outbuildings or minor features. These were significant architectural works that had never appeared on any map, any archaeological survey, any official record. They'd been sitting there, invisible, for 500 years. The implications were immediate and obvious. If 12 major structures existed just outside the known boundaries of Machu Picchu, how many more might be hidden in the surrounding valleys? How large was the original complex? These weren't theoretical questions. The LiDAR scans provided concrete evidence that large portions of the site remained undiscovered despite over a century of archaeological work. What makes this particularly noteworthy is where these structures were found. The areas that revealed the 12 buildings are restricted zones. Tourists don't have access. Most researchers don't have access either. These sections have been controlled by the Peruvian government and kept off-limits for decades. Nobody had been allowed to conduct comprehensive surveys there. When someone finally got permission to scan those areas with modern technology, they found 12 buildings that had been hidden for 5 centuries. It took weeks to discover what had been invisible for generations, simply because the technology was finally applied to areas that had previously been closed to investigation. This discovery opened questions about how much of Machu Picchu has actually been properly surveyed and mapped. If restricted areas contain major undiscovered structures, and if 60% of the known site exists underground, what percentage of the total complex has been documented? 10%? 20%? Less. Nobody knows for certain, and that uncertainty becomes significant when you're making decisions about tourism capacity and infrastructure development. Then in 2025, the geological findings added another layer of complexity. A geologist working with satellite imagery noticed something unusual in the data beneath Machu Picchu. 2 major fault lines, each stretching approximately 175 kilometers, crossed directly underneath the citadel. Not near it, not in the general vicinity, but directly beneath it. The intersection point sits almost exactly where the main temple complex stands, forming what looks like a perfect X when viewed from above. Fault lines typically indicate geological instability. They're where tectonic plates meet and grind against each other, causing earthquakes. Having a major archaeological site sitting on top of intersecting fault lines sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. But when researchers ran computer simulations to model earthquake scenarios, the results were counterintuitive. They ran over 1,000 different simulations, testing various earthquake magnitudes and vectors, different angles of stress and release. Every simulation showed the same outcome. The intersection point of these 2 fault lines is extraordinarily stable. The reason has to do with opposing forces. The 2 fault lines push against each other from different directions. Under most circumstances, this would create chaos. But at the specific point where they intersect beneath Machu Picchu, the forces essentially cancel out. It's a geological sweet spot, a zone where the ground barely moves even when the surrounding region experiences significant seismic activity. The Inca built their most important site on the single most earthquake-resistant point in the entire area. Finding this spot required satellite imaging and advanced geological modeling, technologies that didn't exist until the late 20th century. The Inca didn't have satellites, they didn't have computers to run seismic simulations, yet somehow they identified this precise location and built it there. Either this represents extraordinary luck, choosing the one perfect spot by chance, or it suggests the Inca understood subsurface geology with a sophistication that doesn't align with our assumptions about 15th century technological capabilities. The earthquake resistance isn't theoretical. Peru experiences major seismic events regularly. Cusco, the nearest major city, has been damaged by earthquakes multiple times throughout recorded history. Buildings collapse, infrastructure fails, lives are lost. But Machu Picchu continues standing. 500 years of earthquakes, and the structural integrity remains largely intact. No major collapse, no catastrophic failure. The stones that were fitted together without mortar in the 1400s are still fitted together today. Modern engineers studying the site discovered that the visible structures represent only part of the construction achievement. As mentioned earlier, roughly 60% of Machu Picchu exists underground. When excavation teams dug approximately 9 feet beneath the visible terraces, they found elaborate subterranean infrastructure. Drainage systems, foundation, networks, retaining walls, water channels. An entire hidden layer of engineering beneath what everyone photographs. The terraces that tourists admire aren't just agricultural platforms, they're the visible components of a massive water management system. The underground infrastructure manages water flow across the entire site, preventing erosion and stabilizing the mountain against the exact seismic forces those fault lines should be generating. The drainage network would impress modern civil engineers. Water enters at the highest point, flows through stone-lined conduits, gets redistributed across dozens of terraces, passes through gravel filtration layers, and exits at the base of the mountain. After 5 centuries, there's zero pooling, zero erosion. The system still functions exactly as designed. This was accomplished without iron tools, without wheels, without mortar binding the precisely fitted stones together. The engineering knowledge required to create a drainage system that would remain functional for half a millennium is considerable. The fact that it was built with Stone Age technology makes it remarkable. The fact that it still works today makes it almost inexplicable by conventional understanding of what civilizations could achieve in the pre-modern era. At the highest point of the complex sits the Intihuatana stone. For decades, archaeologists classified it as a ceremonial object, possibly used in religious rituals, maybe decorative. Then modern measurement techniques were applied to it. GPS satellites confirmed that the stone is aligned within 3 degrees of true north. This isn't magnetic north, which shifts over time as the Earth's magnetic field fluctuates. This is true geographic north, the actual pole. The stone functions as a solar calendar, marking solstices and equinoxes with accuracy down to about 15 minutes throughout the year. 3 degrees of precision. That's what 15th century stone carvers achieved without telescopes, without precision instruments, without any of the tools modern astronomers use for celestial measurement. The level of astronomical knowledge encoded in this single carved stone matches what contemporary space agencies use for satellite calibration. 500 years ago, at 8,000 feet elevation, using hand tools and direct observation, the Inca created an astronomical instrument that remains accurate by modern GPS standards. Each of these discoveries, DNA analysis, LiDAR mapping, geological surveys, engineering assessments, astronomical measurements, revealed something unexpected. Taken together, they paint a picture of Machu Picchu as far more sophisticated than the traditional interpretation suggested. This wasn't just a palace where an emperor went to relax. This was a precisely engineered complex, built on a deliberately chosen geological formation, designed to last, populated by a carefully selected diverse group of people brought from across an empire for purposes we're only beginning to understand. And that's the context for what happens next. Because just as these discoveries were being published and peer-reviewed, just as researchers were calling for careful preservation and further study, the Peruvian government decided it was time to fast-track an airport that had been abandoned for 15 years. In January 2026, Peru's Ministry of Culture approved a master plan for Machu Picchu's protection. The document outlined conservation guidelines, visitor management protocols, and preservation goals extending to 2046. 20 years of careful stewardship, at least on paper. The plan addressed concerns that researchers had been raising for years about over-tourism, infrastructure strain, and the need to protect the site's integrity for future generations. Environmental groups and archaeological organizations praised the announcement. It looked like the government was finally taking preservation seriously. 3 weeks later, in February 2026, the same government greenlit the Chinchero International Airport project. 3 weeks from announcing protection measures to approving a development that would fundamentally alter the entire region's tourism dynamics. The airport had been stuck in bureaucratic and legal limbo for 15 years. Corruption investigations, cancelled contracts, financial scandals, political turnover. For over a decade, absolutely nothing happened with this project. It seemed destined to remain permanently unfinished, one of those infrastructure proposals that gets announced with fanfare and then quietly forgotten when reality sets in. But in early 2026, the project wasn't just revived. It was fast-tracked. The government set a target operational date of late 2027. That's approximately 18 months from approval to actual commercial flights landing. For context, major international airports typically require years of construction, testing, and certification, even after all approvals are in place. The timeline being proposed for Chinchero is extraordinarily compressed. The projected capacity is 8 million visitors per year. Current tourist numbers to Machu Picchu fluctuate depending on the season and global economic conditions, but recent years have averaged somewhere around 3 to 4 million annual visitors. 8 million represents roughly a doubling, possibly more than doubling, of current levels. Those visitors would flow through the Sacred Valley, a region that already experiences infrastructure challenges during peak tourist season. Water supply, waste management, road capacity, accommodation availability, all of these systems are currently strained. Doubling the visitor load would require massive infrastructure upgrades throughout the valley, not just at Machu Picchu itself. The runway for this airport is being constructed on top of 600-year-old Inca agricultural terraces in Chinchero. These aren't abandoned ruins being preserved under glass. These terraces still function. 6 centuries after they were built, the irrigation systems work, the drainage performs as designed, the structural engineering holds. It's the same technology, the same construction tradition, the same engineering principles that make Machu Picchu's underground infrastructure possible. The terraces at Chinchero represent a living example of Inca hydraulic engineering. Researchers study them to better understand how the systems at Machu Picchu were designed and built. Peru is preparing to pave over functioning Inca engineering to build a runway, and the timing of this decision is what makes people uncomfortable. When you line up the events chronologically, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. For 15 years, nothing happened. The airport sat completely dead. Corruption scandals involving Odebrecht, the Brazilian construction conglomerate, had frozen contracts and embarrassed officials. Billions of dollars evaporated into legal battles. Political administrations changed. Nobody wanted to touch the project. It was toxic, associated with corruption, seen as a symbol of everything wrong with infrastructure development in the region. Then the scientific discoveries started being published. In 2023, Yale released the DNA findings showing Machu Picchu wasn't what historians thought it was. The population was genetically diverse, deliberately assembled from across the empire. In 2024, LiDAR scans revealed 12 hidden structures in restricted zones. The site was bigger than documented, with significant archaeology in areas the public couldn't access. In 2025, geological surveys confirmed the unusual fault line intersection, and engineers documented that 60% of the site exists underground, invisible to casual observation. By early 2026, the picture was clear. Machu Picchu is far more complex, more precisely engineered, and more deliberately constructed than previous research suggested. Every new study revealed another layer of sophistication. And in response to these revelations, within weeks of each other, Peru approved both a protection plan and an airport that contradicts everything that plan supposedly stands for. Here's what makes this particularly problematic. The capacity study, the official environmental and infrastructure assessment that will determine whether the Sacred Valley can sustainably handle 8 million visitors, isn't due until September 2026. That's 7 months after the airport was approved. They approved the construction before completing the study that's supposed to determine whether the construction makes sense. The report will be delivered in September. Airport approval came in February. This isn't standard procedure for major infrastructure projects, especially ones in UNESCO World Heritage areas. Typically, environmental impact assessments and capacity studies come first. You determine whether a region can handle the development, then you approve the development if the studies indicate sustainability. Peru reversed this process. The decision was made before the data existed to support it. Independent assessments conducted by international organizations have already indicated what the September report will likely say. The Sacred Valley cannot sustainably support that volume of tourism under current infrastructure conditions. Water systems are inadequate. Waste management can't scale to those numbers. Road infrastructure connecting the valley to Cusco is already congested during peak season. Archaeological preservation becomes exponentially more difficult as foot traffic increases. None of these systems can simply double capacity without massive investment and years of construction. And even with investment, there are physical limits to how many people can move through these mountain valleys without causing environmental degradation. The airport will almost certainly open regardless of what the capacity study says. The construction contracts are being finalized now. Equipment is being positioned. The decision has been made at levels where a technical report about carrying capacity is unlikely to reverse course. This is how infrastructure development often works in practice. Political and economic decisions get made first, then studies are commissioned to provide post hoc justification. The money involved helps explain the urgency. 8 million tourists per year flowing through a new international airport generates revenue at multiple levels. Airlines purchase landing rights and pay fees. Hotels and resorts fill rooms. Transportation companies move people between the airport and various destinations. Tour operators organize excursions. Restaurants, souvenir shops, guides, all of them benefit from increased volume. Tax revenue increases at local and national levels. There are significant economic incentives for pushing this project through. The corruption context matters here. In 2019, the Odebrecht scandal tore through South American governments. The Brazilian construction giant had paid billions in bribes across 12 countries to secure infrastructure contracts. Peru was hit particularly hard. Presidents were implicated. Officials were arrested. Public trust in infrastructure projects collapsed. The Chinchero airport was one of the contracts entangled in this mess. Construction had started, then stopped when the investigations began. For years, the site sat abandoned, a physical reminder of institutional corruption. Fast forward to 2026, and there are new contracts, a new bidding process, technically a fresh start. But the same infrastructure networks exist. The same political relationships that controlled contract distribution in 2015 didn't disappear because of investigations. They adapted. The economic incentives that made the original project attractive to certain parties are still present. 8 million tourists represent enormous revenue flow, and that revenue doesn't primarily go to archaeologists or preservation efforts. It flows to the established networks that have controlled Peruvian infrastructure contracts for decades. Following the money reveals who benefits and who makes decisions. The scientific community doesn't benefit from increased tourism. Individual researchers don't see financial gain from 8 million visitors walking over the site they're trying to study. Archaeological preservation actually becomes more difficult and more expensive as visitor numbers increase. The people calling for caution, for careful capacity studies, for gradual sustainable development, these people have no financial stake in the airport opening quickly. Their concerns are based on the research they've conducted and the evidence they've gathered about what the site actually is and how fragile the surrounding ecosystem has become. The organizations pushing for rapid airport development have very different incentives. They benefit from volume, from construction contracts, from increased tourist flow, from the economic activity that 8 million visitors per year would generate. This doesn't automatically make them wrong or corrupt, but it does mean their priorities differ fundamentally from those of the scientific community. The researchers haven't been quiet about their concerns. Scientists from Yale, Cambridge, and Japanese archaeological institutions have published warnings in peer-reviewed journals and presented findings at international conferences. The increased foot traffic, the vibration from that many people moving across the site, the moisture from breath and bodies, the infrastructure development required to accommodate 8 million visitors, all of these factors pose direct threats to the site's structural integrity. Remember, 60% of Machu Picchu is underground. The drainage systems, the foundation networks, the invisible engineering that prevents the mountain from collapsing or eroding, that infrastructure has survived 500 years of naturals. Weathering. Rain, wind, temperature fluctuations, occasional earthquakes. The site was designed to withstand these forces. But it was never tested against 8 million pairs of feet per year, walking across terraces, leaning on walls, touching stones. The cumulative effect of that much human contact is unknown, and once damage occurs at that scale, it's often irreversible. The terraces at Chinchero that are being destroyed for the runway share the same engineering DNA as Machu Picchu. Same construction techniques, same hydrological principles, same precision stone fitting. Researchers study the Chinchero terraces specifically because they're still functional, still demonstrating how Inca engineering worked in practice. Destroying them doesn't just erase 600 years of agricultural history. It eliminates a living laboratory for understanding how Machu Picchu itself was constructed and how it continues to function. Peru's official response to these scientific warnings has been silence. No published rebuttals, no counter-arguments engaging with the data, no public discussion of how to balance preservation with economic development. Just silence and a construction timeline that keeps accelerating. One side has peer-reviewed research, DNA evidence, LiDAR mapping, geological modeling, engineering assessments, and 5 centuries of structural proof demonstrating why caution is warranted. The other side has economic growth projections and a runway blueprint. The decision appears to have been made at levels where scientific input is considered advisory at best, irrelevant at worst. The capacity study will be delivered in September, and it will likely confirm what independent assessments have already indicated. The infrastructure can't sustainably support 8 million visitors without significant environmental and archaeological consequences. And the airport construction will continue anyway, because the decision was never really about what the studies would say. The decision was made when someone decided that 15 years of delays had cost enough money and political capital, and it was time to push through regardless of what scientists were discovering in the mountains. So here's where we stand after 5 years of research and analysis. Scientists have revealed what Machu Picchu actually represents. It wasn't a vacation palace where an emperor escaped the pressures of ruling an empire. The evidence points to something far more complex. A deliberately engineered hub, genetically diverse, positioned on a geological formation that shouldn't have been identifiable without modern satellite technology. 60% of the construction exists underground, invisible to anyone just walking through the site. The visible structures align to cosmic references within 3 degrees of accuracy. The plumbing system still functions perfectly after 5 centuries. The foundations withstand earthquakes that flatten modern cities built with steel and concrete. Every scan revealed additional complexity. Every study showed how precisely everything was designed and constructed. Every piece of evidence pointed towards something more significant than a tourist attraction, more important than a scenic historical site where people take photographs. And now, after all of that, after the DNA analysis and the LiDAR mapping and the geological surveys and the engineering assessments, Peru is moving to open the floodgates. The capacity report arrives in September 2026. The airport is scheduled to open in late 2027. But there's a question that becomes difficult to ignore once you've looked at the timeline and the evidence together. What if this isn't really about tourism? What if the recent scans revealed something that certain interests would prefer not to have carefully studied? What if whatever exists underground, whatever is hidden in those restricted zones where the 12 structures were found, whatever those buildings actually contain or represent is more valuable as a revenue stream than as a research site? This isn't about proposing conspiracies or suggesting hidden agendas without evidence. This is about asking whether the timing makes sense when examined objectively. Science is being ignored or at least sidelined in favor of economic development. 600-year-old engineering that still functions perfectly is about to be bulldozed to build a runway for an airport project that sat abandoned for 15 years and suddenly must be finished in 18 months. Why the urgency? What changed between 2025 and 2026 that made this project go from completely stalled to absolutely critical? The official explanation focuses on economic opportunity and tourism development. Peru needs the revenue, the region needs jobs, tourism drives the local economy, and increasing capacity makes financial sense. These are legitimate arguments, and they're probably true on their face, but they don't explain the timing or the rush. If economic development was the primary concern, why did the project sit dead for 15 years? Economic incentives existed throughout that entire period. Tourist demand existed. The region needed jobs and revenue in 2015, in 2018, in 2021. Yet nothing happened. The project only became urgent after the scientific discoveries started being published. That's the correlation that's difficult to ignore. September 2026 is when the capacity study will be released. Will it matter? Will the findings influence the project timeline, or was the decision already made years ago by people whose priorities don't include archaeological preservation? The countdown has started. Construction equipment is being positioned. Contracts are being finalized. By the time the capacity study says what everyone expects it to say, that the infrastructure can't sustainably support 8 million visitors without significant environmental and archaeological consequences, the project will have momentum that a technical report is unlikely to stop. Machu Picchu sits in the middle of all this, the impossible city on the impossible geological X, built with precision that challenges our assumptions about what civilizations could achieve 500 years ago. Every new discovery over the past 5 years has made it seem more remarkable, more worthy of careful study and preservation. And the official response has been to accelerate development that researchers warn could damage the very things that make the site scientifically valuable. There's a pattern throughout history where important archaeological sites get caught between preservation and development. Economic pressure usually wins. Tourist revenue, construction contracts, job creation, these factors carry political weight that scientific concerns often cannot match. Researchers can publish papers about DNA, evidence, and geological formations, and engineering sophistication, but those papers don't generate immediate revenue or create jobs in regions that need economic development. The uncomfortable reality is that we might be watching a decision play out in real time where the scientific value of Machu Picchu becomes secondary to its economic value as a tourist destination. Once the airport opens and 8 million people per year start flowing through the sacred valley, the site's function changes permanently. It stops being primarily a research location and becomes primarily a revenue generator. The infrastructure required to manage that many visitors, the facilities, the roads, the services, all of that development alters the environment irreversibly. Maybe the capacity study will surprise everyone and indicate that sustainable development is possible. Maybe there are engineering solutions that allow 8 million visitors per year without damaging underground drainage systems or eroding terraces. Maybe the concerns researchers have raised will turn out to be overstated, and the site will withstand the increased traffic without significant deterioration. These outcomes are possible, though the independent assessments conducted so far suggest otherwise. Or maybe what we're seeing is exactly what it appears to be: a rush to capitalize on a famous site before too many uncomfortable questions get asked about what else might be discovered there if researchers had unlimited access and unlimited time to conduct comprehensive surveys. The restricted zones where LiDAR found 12 unknown structures represent a fraction of the area surrounding Machu Picchu. What else is out there? What would a complete survey of the entire region reveal? Those are questions that become harder to answer once construction begins and tourist infrastructure expands across the landscape. The story is just getting started. Whatever happens in September when the capacity report is released, whatever the airport construction reveals or destroys, whatever additional discoveries researchers make in the time remaining before development accelerates, all of that will tell us whether scientific preservation or economic development takes priority when they come into direct conflict. Machu Picchu will still be there either way, but what it becomes and what we learn from it depends entirely on decisions being made right now by people whose motivations and priorities remain somewhat opaque to outside observation.